Government documents are, by professional design, the most conservative form of record-keeping that modern institutions produce. They are written by people whose careers depend on precision of language, whose institutional position requires them to say only what they can defend in a subsequent review, and whose bureaucratic culture discourages the inclusion of claims that might embarrass the agency responsible for the document. This is why the specific phrases that appear in the documents at the center of this script carry the weight that they do. Across a span of 76 years, official records produced by the United States Army Air Forces, the British Ministry of Defense, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and a committee of the United States House of Representatives have each, at specific and documented moments, used language that their authors knew would require explanation. What follows is drawn entirely from the official record: a press release retracted within 24 hours, a classified memo to a foreign government, a Pentagon program's internal research catalogued by the Defense Intelligence Agency, a federal intelligence assessment delivered to Congress, and testimony given under oath before the House Oversight Committee by a decorated intelligence officer who used, in a formal proceeding of the United States government, the phrase non-human biologics. This is what the documents say. The press release: they took back Roswell Army Airfield, New Mexico, July 1947. The document that started the modern era of government entanglement with the question of non-human presence was not a classified memo or a restricted internal report. It was a press release. On the 8th of July, 1947, the public information officer at Roswell Army Airfield in New Mexico, First Lieutenant Walter Haut, issued a statement to local radio stations and newspapers that had been authorized by the base commander, Colonel William Blanchard. The statement was brief. It announced that the 509th Bomb Group, the most elite nuclear-capable unit in the United States Army Air Forces, and the only outfit in the world that had at that point dropped atomic bombs in combat, had recovered a flying disc from a ranch in the surrounding desert, and that the object had been forwarded to higher headquarters. The Roswell Daily Record ran the story under the headline, "RAAF Captures Flying Saucer on Ranch in Roswell Region." The Associated Press moved the wire story nationally within hours. By the afternoon of July 8th, the press office at Roswell Army Airfield had received inquiries from news organizations across the country and from several foreign governments. By the morning of the 9th of July, 1947, the United States Army Air Forces had issued a second statement, saying that what had been recovered was a weather balloon. The man who had gone to the debris field and handled the recovered material before it was transported was Major Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer of the 509th Bomb Group. Marcel gave his first public account of what he had found on the ranch of W.W. Mac Brazel in 1978 to UFO researcher Stanton Friedman, and in the years before his death in 1986, he gave additional interviews, maintaining a consistent account. The material he handled in the field and at the Roswell base was not a weather balloon. He described pieces of very thin, extremely lightweight foil that could not be bent or permanently creased, structural members made of a material that resembled balsa wood but could not be burned or broken, and symbols or markings along some of the structural pieces that he did not recognize. Marcel was a career military intelligence officer who had examined both conventional and experimental aircraft wreckage in his professional capacity. He said he knew what a weather balloon looked like, that he had reported them himself, and that what was on the ground of the Brazel Ranch was not one. His account is the primary eyewitness record from someone who handled the physical material before it left New Mexico. The weather balloon explanation did not satisfy the people who had seen the initial press release or who had heard the early radio reports, and it did not satisfy Congressman Steve Schiff of New Mexico, who in 1993 contacted the General Accounting Office to request a formal accounting of what records the federal government held related to the Roswell incident. The GAO investigation took approximately 18 months and resulted in a report issued in July 1995. The report's central finding was that the outgoing messages from Roswell Army Airfield for the period covering the summer of 1947 had been destroyed, and that the destruction had occurred without authorization and in violation of federal records retention requirements. The report noted that the GAO was unable to determine who had ordered the destruction or when it had taken place, but confirmed that the records were gone and that their destruction had not been sanctioned by the normal regulatory process. The GAO report is itself a government document, and what it documents is the absence of documentation in a manner that the agency found irregular. The Air Force's own investigation of the Roswell case, conducted in 1994 at the direction of the Secretary of the Air Force and published as the Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico desert concluded that the recovered material was debris from a classified high-altitude balloon project called Project Mogul, a program designed to monitor Soviet nuclear tests at altitude using sensitive acoustic sensors. Colonel Richard Weaver, who authored the report, reviewed thousands of pages of classified records and interviewed dozens of personnel, and his conclusion was that Project Mogul debris accounted for the physical material recovered on the Brazil ranch, that the initial press release had been issued in error by an officer who did not know about the classified program, and that the weather balloon cover story had been a reasonable, if inaccurate, improvisation to avoid disclosing the existence of Mogul. The 1994 Air Force report is a careful and thoroughly documented piece of institutional analysis, and it answered some of the questions that the Roswell case had generated for 47 years. It did not answer all of them. Jesse Marcel's description of material properties that did not correspond to any balloon debris ever recovered, the destruction of the Roswell Army Airfield outgoing messages documented by the GAO, and the testimony of multiple base personnel who described seeing material and bodies inconsistent with balloon wreckage, remained outside what the Mogul explanation could accommodate. Among the witnesses whose accounts fall outside the Mogul explanation is Mortimer Mortensen, who served as a military policeman at Roswell Army Airfield in 1947 and gave testimony to researcher Stanton Friedman in the 1990s, describing being posted as a guard at a hangar where material from the recovery operation was stored, and seeing objects being moved under heavy security conditions that were inconsistent with routine balloon debris handling. Glenn Dennis, who worked as a mortician for a Roswell funeral home with a contract to provide mortuary services to the airbase, gave a signed affidavit describing a phone call he received from the base mortuary officer in early July 1947, asking about the availability of small, hermetically sealed caskets and about preservation procedures for bodies that had been exposed to the elements for an extended period. Dennis gave his account publicly in 1989 and signed the affidavit in 1991. He maintained the account consistently until his death. The base nurse he named as an additional witness has never been identified in service records, which his critics have cited as a significant problem with his testimony. And Dennis himself acknowledged in later years that some details in his early public accounts were inaccurate. His signed affidavit remains part of the documented record of Roswell witness testimony, regardless of its contested status. The 1947 Roswell press release was in the institutional record of the United States government, a document that existed for less than 24 hours before being replaced by a contradicting document issued by a higher authority. What the press release said in those 24 hours, that the most operationally significant military unit in the American arsenal had recovered a flying disc from a New Mexico ranch, is a matter of permanent historical record. The authorization chain for that press release ran from Lieutenant Hout, who wrote it, to Colonel Blanchard, who approved it, and the decision to issue it was made by a base commander who had commanded the 509th through Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and who was not, by any professional assessment available, a man given to careless public statements. Blanchard later rose to the rank of 4-star general and was serving as Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force at the time of his death in 1966. He never publicly revisited the press release he had authorized. He never issued a statement clarifying his reasons for approving it. He did not, in the 19 years between the Roswell incident and his death, say anything further in the public record about what his unit had recovered from the desert north of Roswell in the first week of July 1947. The documentation generated by the Roswell case across the 50 years following the initial press release is held in multiple institutional repositories, including the National Archives, the Eisenhower Presidential Library, which holds materials related to subsequent briefings, the University of New Mexico's Center for Southwest Research, and the records of the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell itself, which maintains the most comprehensive collection of witness affidavits and investigative documents related to the case. The 8th of July 1947 press release is reproduced in its entirety in multiple archival collections. It is 6 sentences long. In those 6 sentences, an authorized representative of the United States Army Air Forces told the American public, for a period of approximately 24 hours, that a flying disc had been recovered from the desert of New Mexico by the unit that dropped the atomic bomb. The government's retraction arrived the following day. The question of what the first statement was describing has not been officially resolved in the 76 years since. The memo that went to London Defense Intelligence Agency and Ministry of Defense, 1950 to 1997, The United States government's inability to officially resolve what its own press release said in July 1947 did not occur in a vacuum, and as the question of what had been recovered at Roswell remained officially unanswered in Washington, the governments of America's closest allies were conducting their own inquiries and reaching their own internal conclusions in documents that would remain classified for decades. The British government's formal engagement with the question of non-human presence produced a paper trail that runs from 1950 to 1997 and is housed today in the National Archives at Kew in Surrey, where declassified Ministry of Defense files are available to researchers under the Freedom of Information Act. And the most significant single document in that trail is not a sighting report or a witness account, but a memo written by a senior British intelligence official that describes, in the careful and qualified language that senior British intelligence officials use when they are saying something they know to be extraordinary, a briefing he received from American contacts about the nature of what had been recovered from crashed craft. The official was Sir Henry Tizard, Chief Scientific Advisor to the Ministry of Defense and one of the most consequential scientific administrators in British history. The man who had been responsible for the deployment of radar during the Battle of Britain, and the document he produced in 1950 initiated a formal British government program of UFO investigation that would run, under various names and classifications, for nearly 5 decades. Tizard's position on the question was stated clearly in his 1950 memo, which he directed to the Chief of the Air Staff. The reports of unidentified flying objects being received by the British government were not, in his professional judgment, the kind of phenomena that a serious scientific establishment could dismiss without investigation. He recommended the formation of a working party to examine the reports systematically, and the Flying Saucer Working Party was established in that year, chaired by G.L. Turney of the Directorate of Scientific Intelligence. The Working Party's report, issued in 1951 and classified until 2001, examined the best British sighting reports available and concluded that no evidence of craft of non-terrestrial origin had been established, while recommending continued monitoring. What the report's conclusion did not address, and what Tizard's own subsequent correspondence suggests he remained privately unpersuaded by, was the information his American contacts had provided about the physical evidence from New Mexico. The relevant correspondence between Tizard and his American interlocutors has not been fully declassified. What remains in the released files at Kew is sufficient to establish that the conversation happened and that Tizard took it seriously enough to initiate a formal governmental response. The Ministry of Defense's UFO program, which operated under the administrative unit eventually known as SECANT AS2 and later DI-55, produced tens of thousands of pages of documented sighting reports between 1,950 and its formal closure in 2009. The officer most associated with the program in its later years is Nick Pope, who ran the Modi's UFO desk from 1991 to 1994 and has subsequently published extensively about his experience investigating the cases that crossed his desk. Pope's account is that he arrived at the assignment as a conventional skeptic and left it as something more cautious, not a believer in extraterrestrial craft, but a government official who had read the classified files, reviewed the cases that his predecessor officers had investigated, and concluded that a small but irreducible percentage of the reports described objects that the MOD had no conventional explanation for, that demonstrated flight characteristics inconsistent with known technology, and that had been observed at close range by trained military witnesses whose professional credibility was not in question. Pope's most significant contribution to the documented record is his account of the Rendlesham Forest incident of December 1980, which he investigated from the MOD files, and which he has described as the British Roswell, for reasons that the documents support. The Rendlesham Forest incident involved multiple United States Air Force personnel stationed at RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge in Suffolk, England, who encountered an unidentified craft in the forest between the two bases on the nights of December 26 and 28, 1980. The primary witness was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, the deputy base commander, who led a team into the forest on the night of December 28 and dictated a real-time audio account of what his team was encountering as the encounter occurred. The tape recording of Halt's narration, which he made on a standard field recorder while the incident was in progress, captured him, describing a craft with flashing lights moving through the trees, a beam of light descending from it to the ground near his team, and anomalous radiation readings from his team's Geiger counter at the site. Halt subsequently submitted a formal memorandum to the Ministry of Defense on the 13th of January, 1981, describing the incident in official language and noting that the objects had been observed at close range by multiple witnesses, that radiation readings at the landing site had been elevated, and that the events were unexplained. The HALT Memorandum, as it is now known, was declassified and released in 1983 under an American Freedom of Information Act request. It is a document produced by a senior United States Air Force officer, addressed to a foreign government's defense ministry, describing encounters that he witnessed personally and could not explain. What the HALT Memorandum represents, in the institutional record of two governments, is a data point of a specific and unusual kind, not a civilian witness account, not a press release issued in error, but a formal intergovernmental communication from a credentialed military officer describing unexplained phenomena in language that his position required him to defend. HALT has maintained his account consistently for more than 4 decades, including an assigned affidavit submitted to the Coalition for Freedom of Information in 2010, which he stated directly that the objects his team had encountered were not of human manufacture, and that he believed the United States and British governments were aware of the nature of the phenomena and had chosen not to disclose it to the public. The affidavit was signed by a retired United States Air Force colonel who had served as a base commander and whose professional record was without significant blemish. It is a document of the kind that the Roswell case, for all its accumulated witness testimony, largely lacked. A formal, sworn statement from a career military officer of senior rank who was present at the event and is willing to attach his name and his reputation to the specific claim that what he saw was not made by human beings. The Ministry of Defense closed its UFO program formally on the 1st of December 2009, issuing a statement explaining that 55 years of investigation had produced no evidence of any threat to the United Kingdom and that the program's resources were better deployed elsewhere. The files were released to the National Archives at Kew in a series of tranches between 2008 and 2013, comprising approximately 52,000 pages of sighting reports, correspondence, internal assessments, and investigative memoranda. Researchers who have reviewed the collection have noted that the files released represent the cases the Ministry of Defense was willing to release, and that the categories of material that would be most significant: communications with American intelligence counterparts about physical evidence, assessments produced by DI-55 at the classified level above what was released, and materials related specifically to the Rendlesham incident that go beyond the HALT Memorandum, remain either classified or, as in the case of certain Rendlesham-related files, listed as missing from the archive. The MOD has acknowledged that some files from the relevant period cannot be located. The pattern that the Roswell case established in 1947 of official documentation that exists in incomplete form with the most consequential portions unaccounted for appears again in the British Archive, 50 years later, in a different country, in a different institutional system, producing a structurally identical gap. What the British government's 5 decades of formal investigation produced, in summary, is this: a program initiated by one of Britain's most distinguished scientific administrators on the basis of information he received from American contacts about physical evidence. Tens of thousands of pages of sighting reports that the program's own officers concluded contained an irreducible percentage of genuinely unexplained cases. A formal intergovernmental memorandum from a senior American officer describing a close-range encounter with craft he could not identify. A signed affidavit from that same officer, given after his retirement and outside institutional pressure, using language that placed the craft's origin outside human manufacture. And an archive that is missing the files most relevant to the question the program was established to answer. The National Archives at Kew holds what was released. The documents that would resolve the question that Tizard raised in 1950 are either still classified, still held in American repositories that have not been opened, or are among the files that the Ministry of Defense acknowledges it cannot locate. The British government opened a formal inquiry into the question of non-human presence and arrived, 55 years later, at an incomplete archive and a closed program. The question it was investigating is still open. The Pentagon program that wasn't supposed to exist. Defense Intelligence Agency, Washington, D.C., 2007 to 2017. If the British government's approach to the question of non-human presence was characterized by institutional caution, formal program structures, and an archive that ended in acknowledged gaps, the American government's parallel engagement in the first decade of the 21st century was characterized by something different: a classified program funded through a congressional black budget, run out of the Pentagon by a career intelligence officer, producing a library of technical research documents that the Defense Intelligence Agency would eventually acknowledge existed and then spend several years declining to release in full. The program that became publicly known as the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or ATIP, was not the result of a formal institutional initiative of the kind that Tizard had proposed to the British Chief of the Air Staff in 1950. It was the result of a conversation between Nevada Senator Harry Reid, then the Senate Majority Leader, and Robert Bigelow, a Las Vegas aerospace entrepreneur who had been funding private research into anomalous aerial phenomena for years and who told Reid that the subject warranted serious government attention. Reid agreed. In late 2007, working with Senators Daniel Inouye of Hawaii and Ted Stevens of Alaska, Reid secured approximately $22 million in classified funding through the Senate Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, and the program that funding established operated inside the Pentagon for the next decade in a manner that most of the people working in the building were not aware of. The officer Reid identified to run the program was Luis Elizondo, a career counterintelligence and intelligence operations officer who had served in Afghanistan, Guantanamo, and Latin America before arriving at the office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. Elizondo has described his own recruitment into the program as originating in a question he was asked about what the most significant unacknowledged threat to American national security might be, and his answer, which drew on his review of incident reports from military pilots and base commanders that had been accumulating in various corners of the Pentagon without systematic analysis, was that the objects being reported in restricted airspace above American military installations and carrier strike groups were behaving in ways that no known aircraft could replicate, and that no one in the defense establishment was treating as a serious intelligence question. The program Elizondo ran, which operated under the bureaucratic cover of the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program within the Defense Intelligence Agency's structure, contracted the primary research work to Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, a Nevada company, and produced 38 technical research documents over the course of several years, covering topics that the DIA would eventually confirm included advanced propulsion concepts, invisibility, cloaking, traversable wormholes, warp drives, and the biological effects of unidentified aerial phenomena on human witnesses. The 38 documents, known informally as the Defense Intelligence Reference Documents, or DIRDs, were written by scientists and researchers under contract, and represented the government's own attempt to understand whether the technology implied by the observed behavior of unidentified craft was physically possible, and, if so, what its theoretical basis might be. The incident that gave the AATIP program its most significant documented case was not a ground-based sighting or a radar contact, but a visual encounter between United States Navy fighter pilots and an object of undetermined origin approximately 100 miles off the coast of San Diego on the 14th of November, 2004. Commander David Fravor, a graduate of the Naval Academy with 18 years of experience as a naval aviator and the commanding officer of Strike Fighter Squadron 41, was flying an F/A-18F Super Hornet with his weapons systems officer when he was directed by controllers aboard the USS Princeton, the Ticonderoga-class cruiser coordinating the carrier strike group's air operations, to investigate an anomalous contact that the Princeton's SPY-1 radar had been tracking for approximately 2 weeks. The Princeton's radar operators had been observing objects that descended from above 80,000 feet to just above sea level in seconds, and then hovered, behavior that the ship's combat systems operators had reported up the chain of command without receiving any explanation or instruction. When Fravor arrived at the designated coordinates and descended to investigate, he found a churning disturbance on the ocean surface, approximately the size of a Boeing 737 and above it, a white object shaped like a large tic-tac, approximately 40 feet in length, with no visible wings, no exhaust, and no flight control surfaces, hovering and then maneuvering in ways that Fravor described, in every account he has given since, as beyond anything he had ever seen or anything he believed current technology could produce. Fravor attempted to intercept the object. As he descended toward it in a circular approach, the object mirrored his movements, ascending toward him at the same rate he descended toward it, maintaining the distance between them. When he reversed his approach and dove directly at it, the object accelerated away and disappeared from visual range in under 2 seconds. The Princeton's radar controllers reported that the object had immediately reappeared on their screens at the Combat Air Patrol Point, a rendezvous location approximately 60 miles away, where it appeared to have traveled in the time it took Fravor's aircraft to turn around and begin flying toward it. A second A-18F crew, pilot Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich and her weapons systems officer, also observed the object from a distance during the same encounter. the forward-looking infrared camera on a third aircraft, flown by pilots from a different squadron who had been scrambled to investigate after Fravor's encounter, recorded the object's thermal signature, and the footage was preserved in the military's files. The video, known as the FLIR 1 video, was among 3 pieces of footage that Elizondo authorized for release through the To the Stars Academy of Arts and Science in December 2017, after he had left the Pentagon. The Department of Defense confirmed the video's authenticity in April 2020 and stated that they had never been officially cleared for release, which was an institutional acknowledgement that the material was genuine, that it had been improperly handled, and that what it showed remained unidentified. Elizondo resigned from the office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence on the 4th of October 2017, submitting a resignation letter to Secretary of Defense James Mattis, in which he stated that the program he had been running deserved more institutional support than it had received, that the question of non-human intelligence operating in American airspace was serious enough to require a formal and adequately resourced government response, and that the bureaucratic resistance and interagency conflict he had encountered in attempting to elevate the program's findings through official channels had made his continued effective operation within the system impossible. The resignation letter is a government document of a specific and unusual kind, a senior intelligence officer's formal statement to a cabinet secretary that the United States government was failing to adequately address a phenomenon that the officer believed constituted a genuine national security matter, and that the failure was institutional rather than evidentiary. The letter has been described in subsequent reporting but has not been released in its entirety. What Elizondo said publicly after his resignation, beginning with a New York Times story published on the 16th of December 2017 that revealed the program's existence for the first time, was that AATIP had been collecting evidence of craft that demonstrated flight characteristics not achievable by any known human technology, and that the program's findings had been briefed to senior officials in the defense establishment, who had chosen not to act on them. The New York Times story of the 16th of December 2017, reported by Helene Cooper, Ralph Blumenthal, and Leslie Kean, was the first time the American public learned that the Pentagon had been running a classified program to investigate unidentified aerial phenomena, that the program had been funded with $22 million in congressional appropriations, and that it had produced both classified research documents and video footage of encounters between military aircraft and objects that the program's leadership could not explain. The story named Elizondo, named Harry Reid, included Reid's on-record statement that the program had produced findings that warranted further investigation, and reproduced a frame from the FLIR 1 video showing the object Fravor had encountered off San Diego 13 years earlier. It ran on the front page. The Pentagon's response, issued the same day, stated that the program had been terminated in 2012 and that it had found no evidence of alien life. Elizondo disputed both elements of that response, stating that the program had continued operating after 2012 under different bureaucratic arrangements, and that the characterization of its findings as negative was not accurate. The institutional disagreement between a serving Pentagon spokesman and a former Pentagon intelligence officer about what a classified government program had found and whether it was still operating is itself a document of the public record, and it has not been resolved in the years since it was first stated. The 38 defense intelligence reference documents that the AATIP program produced remain partially classified. A list of their titles was made public through a Freedom of Information Act request processed in 2020, and the titles alone constitute a catalog of the government's own assessment of what technologies would be required to explain the observed behavior of unidentified craft: traversable wormholes, stargates, and negative energy, warp drive, dark energy, and the manipulation of extra dimensions, anti-gravity for aerospace applications, invisibility cloaking, high-frequency gravitational wave communications, and, among others, a document titled Anomalous Acute and Subacute Field Effects on Human and Biological Tissues. That last document addresses the biological effects on human witnesses of close-range encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena, effects that Elizondo and subsequent investigators would describe as including radiation burns, neurological effects, and in several cases, medical outcomes that the witnesses' physicians found difficult to explain. The program that was not supposed to exist produced a research library documenting the government's own attempt to understand technology that, if it is what the observed flight characteristics imply, is not operated by any human government. That library exists. Most of it is still classified. The Intelligence Assessment Congress didn't expect Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Washington, D.C., 2021 to 2023. The classified research library that the Defense Intelligence Agency had spent a decade accumulating without public acknowledgement did not remain the government's only formal engagement with the BSA. Question. And the institutional momentum that Luis Elizondo's resignation and the December 2017 New York Times story had set in motion inside the Congressional Oversight Committees produced, 4 years later, a document that no previous administration had been willing to produce, a formal, unclassified intelligence assessment of unidentified aerial phenomena delivered by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to the Congressional Intelligence Committees on the 25th of June, 2021. The preliminary assessment, Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, was 9 pages long, carried the official seal of the ODNI, and had been produced by the UAP task force that the Department of Defense had established in August 2020 under pressure from the Senate Intelligence Committee, whose members had grown sufficiently concerned about the pattern of military pilot encounters being reported from carrier strike groups that they had inserted a provision into the Intelligence Authorization Act requiring the moment assessment's delivery. The document represented the first time in American history that the executive branch of the federal government had produced and delivered to Congress an official, unclassified intelligence assessment, specifically examining whether objects operating in American airspace and in proximity to military installations were of human or non-human origin, and its conclusions were more carefully worded and therefore more significant than the press coverage they generated immediately upon release suggested. The assessment examined 144 UAP reports originating from United States government sources, the majority of them from naval aviators, covering a period from 2004 to 2021. Of the 144 cases, the task force was able to identify a single one with high confidence, a large, deflating balloon. The remaining 143 cases were placed in one of 5 potential explanatory categories, which the assessment listed as airborne clutter, natural atmospheric phenomena, United States government or industry developmental programs, foreign adversary systems, and a 5th category labeled Other. 18 of the 143 unresolved cases described objects that had demonstrated what the assessment called advanced technology, specifically movement patterns that included sudden acceleration, hypersonic velocities without apparent propulsion, and maneuverability without observable control surfaces, observed simultaneously by multiple sensors or multiple witnesses in conditions that the task force considered reliable. The assessment did not conclude that these 18 cases represented non-human technology. It stated clearly that it lacked sufficient data to reach a conclusion. What the document's language did, through the mechanism of institutional understatement, was establish formally and in writing that the United States intelligence community had examined objects demonstrating performance characteristics inconsistent with all known human aerospace technology and had been unable to explain them. The assessment's authors made a specific and deliberate choice in the document's framing that congressional staffers familiar with intelligence community writing have noted as significant. The document did not use the language of debunking. It did not characterize the unexplained cases as likely explainable upon further investigation, the traditional formulation used in intelligence assessments when the assessed phenomenon is expected to yield to additional analysis. It stated that the task force lacked the data required to assess the cases fully and recommended the development of standardized reporting mechanisms, dedicated analytical resources, and interagency coordination structures that did not currently exist. The recommendation for new institutional infrastructure, in the language of the intelligence community, is an acknowledgement that the phenomenon being assessed is expected to persist and to produce additional cases requiring analysis. An institution that believes it is looking at misidentified weather balloons does not recommend the construction of a permanent analytical apparatus to study them. The ODNI assessment recommended exactly that, and Congress began acting on the recommendation within months. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, who sat on the Senate Armed Services Committee, worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to insert into the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2022 a provision establishing the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, known as AARO, within the Department of Defense. The legislation directed AARO to serve as the central hub for UAP detection, identification, attribution, and, if necessary, mitigation across all domains of operation, including air, sea, space, and subsurface. It directed the office to establish relationships with the intelligence community, with the armed services, and with interagency partners, including the Department of Energy, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. It required annual unclassified reports to Congress on AARO's findings and directed the office to establish a secure mechanism through which current and former government employees could report information about UAP that they had not previously been able to report through normal channels. The establishment of a formal reporting mechanism for people inside the government who had information they had been unable to share was a legislative acknowledgement, written into federal law, that such people existed and that the information they held was considered by the congressional authors of the provision to be worth creating a formal institutional pathway to receive. The 2023 Annual Report on Unidentified, Anomalous Phenomena that AARO delivered to Congress, covering the period through 2022, reported that the office had received several hundred new UAP reports since its establishment, bringing the total number of cases under review to approximately 800. The report introduced an expanded definition of the phenomena under investigation that went beyond aerial observations to include objects detected in space and underwater, and it introduced the term transmedium to describe objects that had been observed moving between domains, entering the water from the air, or ascending from below the ocean surface into the atmosphere in ways that no known human vehicle was capable of. The report identified several cases in the new database that it considered of particular concern from a national security perspective without providing the classified details of those cases in the unclassified version, and it stated that a significant number of the cases under review involved objects that AARO had been unable to attribute to any known United States program, any known foreign adversary capability, or any identified natural phenomenon. The institutional language of the 2023 report was measurably different from the careful hedging of the 2021 preliminary assessment, where the earlier document had said it lacked sufficient data. The 2023 report described an active, ongoing phenomenon, producing new cases at a rate that required sustained analytical attention. NASA's Independent Study Group on Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena, which had been commissioned by the agency in 2022, and produced its final report in September 2023, added a second institutional voice to the documented record. The study group, chaired by astrophysicist David Spergel and composed of 16 scientists and researchers, examined the existing data on UAP from a scientific rather than intelligence perspective and reached conclusions that were structurally consistent with the ODNI's findings, despite having been produced through an entirely independent process. The group found that the existing data available to civilian scientists was insufficient to characterize the phenomena, that the stigma attached to the subject within the scientific community had prevented the kind of systematic data collection that would be required to analyze it rigorously, and that the minority of cases involving objects demonstrating anomalous performance characteristics remained unexplained and deserved serious scientific attention. The report's language on the possibility of non-human origin was careful in the way that NASA institutional language is always careful, declining to assert what the evidence did not establish, but its recommendation for a dedicated scientific study program using the full range of NASA's observational assets was a statement that the agency believed the phenomenon was real, persistent, and not yet understood. Two independent government processes, one in the intelligence community and one in the scientific establishment, had now examined the same question and arrived at the same institutional conclusion. Something is there. It is not explained by current knowledge, and it requires further investigation. The documented record produced by the United States government between 2021 and 2023 on the question of unidentified anomalous phenomena is qualitatively different from everything that preceded it. The 1947 Roswell press release lasted 24 hours. The British Ministry of Defence's 5 decades of investigation produced an incomplete archive. The AATIP program operated in classified obscurity for a decade before a resignation letter and a newspaper story forced it into the open. What the 2021 ODNI assessment, the NDAA provision establishing AARO, the 2023 annual report, and the NASA independent study together represent is something the government had not previously produced. A layered, multi-agency, formally documented acknowledgement that unidentified objects of unknown origin are operating in domains that the United States government is responsible for monitoring, that a substantial number of those objects cannot be explained by any known human technology or natural phenomenon, and that the institutional response to their presence requires permanent, adequately resourced, formally established analytical infrastructure. The government has not said what they are. It has said, in 4 separate official documents produced by 3 separate institutional bodies across 2 years, that it does not know, and that finding out is now a formal national priority.